Well, in full disclosure, I am talking about Dutch community, but I'm not talking about water so much. How many of you in the room know where the Bond House is? Okay, and I'll show a map showing you where it is. So if you know where the Bond House is, it's not very close to water, and it's high up on a hill, and it's not in danger of being flooded unless a Noah's Ark type event were to happen. But it was a Dutch community that was up in this part of Montclair. So here's the map of the university, and so I circled the location of the Bond House, and just to orient you, make sure I can, that's the Red Hawk deck. So where's, Dixon Hall is here. So this is Dixon Hall, this building. So where the H is, more or less, is this room. Okay. So the Bond House is at the extreme southern edge of the university, and I'll show a detail. Here's a detail of that map. So you see the Bond House is where it's labeled. And then the Coder House, I should mention that we have this interdisciplinary center on campus. It's called the Center for Heritage and Archaeological Studies. And 3 out of the 4 steering committee members are here. 2 of them are right there, and the other one is me. And our Center for Heritage and Archaeological Studies is located in this house that used to be owned by a family by the name of the Coders. It's a small suburban house, but the university graciously donated that house for us to have our center in, and so we have a lab and storage facilities for artifacts and all that, and a small library. But right, so when Greg Pope mentioned that when I interviewed for the job here, I was hired in 2006. My more or less marching orders that I was given at the time by the then chair of the anthropology department, Dr. Rhoda Halpern, and the chair of the search committee that hired me, with Dr. Tim Renner, who's teaching a course right now, so he's not here. They asked me, being the archaeologist at the time, to give some serious thought as to how to develop the potential for an archaeological field school. For students who are wanting to have an interest in archaeology and think they may want to go on in the field, it's very important as a student, as an undergrad, to at some time in your undergrad career take a formal archaeological field school to learn the basic methods and field techniques and recording and this and that. So I said, okay. And so Tim Renner and I was thinking, well, let's try to make the logistics of this field school as easy as possible, rather than finding an archaeological site 2 hours away that we have to drive to and back each day. I wonder if there's something closer. So Tim and I did what we sometimes call a pedestrian survey, which amounted to we walked across the campus of the university from one end to the other, checking out, does the quad out there in the middle of the university, does that look like any potential for archaeology? And I didn't think so. It looked probably just a great amount of disturbance. And then eventually we made it out to the Bond House, and let's see if I have a picture. This is a Google satellite image of the Bond House. And so you see the driveway going up and surrounding it. You see the house now surrounded by parking lots. But there's a fair amount of green there, and grass. Oh, well. And so here's a picture of it again. So you see the front lawn, and then in the back, and later in this lecture, I'll show you more pictures of the back. The first question I had was, is this house in its original location? Because often people can pick a house up and move it to a different location. And if that were the case here, there'd be really no point in doing archaeology around it because it's not associated with its original context. And that was easy enough to figure out, and found that it was actually listed in both the national and state registers of historic places. And there was quite a bit of, I didn't realize this at the time when I was a new hire here, but there's been a great amount of interest in this house by local community members. And at one point, back in the 1970s, the early 70s, I believe, is when it was nominated to be listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and it was accepted by the federal government and also the state government. And so after learning that, I said, well, like, as Greg said, I've spent many years before coming to Montclair doing work for a private consulting firm as an archaeologist. And we know from experience in doing historic archaeology that often back in, say, the 19th century, and better yet, even the 18th, 17th, 16th, lots of activities took place outside the house, especially in the days of pre-running, pre-plumbing and refrigeration. And if you don't have a toilet inside the house, you have to go someplace, and they built these privies to go outside. And also, if you needed water, you'd have a cistern and that sort of thing. And then all sorts of other activities would go on outside, and they're normally in the backyards of places. So I proposed to Tim, why don't we organize a field school around this house and just see what we find. And I was I'm generally a pessimist at heart in most things. And so I was saying, well, my guess is we're probably not going to find much of interest, but at least we can teach students how to dig a square hole, even if they're not finding anything. So now, one of the procedures in doing any kind of archaeological project is you do not go immediately into the field and start digging. I mean, you can, but it makes a lot more sense to do what we call background research. So you want to learn about the sort of the history, and especially in the case of a historic archaeological site, not prehistoric. You want to learn about the history as far back as you can go, in terms of that's relevant for the time of the house's occupation and construction. So the house was built in 1871. I have to remember my days more about that, 1875 maybe. And so we found some of the older historic maps for the area. This is an 1850 map, and Speertown was the name of this part of Montclair, what's now called Upper Montclair in this period. And Speertown in the 19th century was dominated by Dutch community, and the name Speer was one of the prominent Dutch families. Peter Speer was one of the big names, big name families. And here's on the map, you can see P.G. Speer up there, and then if you can twist your head around, you can read that it says Van Reyper, and there are different spellings of Van Reyper, but there was quite a few of these Van Reypers, and I'll tell you about the Van Reypers in a minute. This is an 1878 map of the area, and by then the house had been built a few years earlier, and it was built by a man by the name of Thomas Van Reyper, one of the Dutch members of the community. 1890 map of the area, and again you see the Van Reyper, Thomas C. Van Reyper across this. How many of you know the Mount Hebron Cemetery? It's that huge cemetery across on Valley Road. So that's the cemetery in 1890. Let's see. I'm going back to the 1878 map. Here's the Mount Hebron Cemetery in 1878, so it was much smaller. See, here's Valley Road right there. This is what was called Fifth Avenue. That's Normal Ave today. And so at that intersection, you know, is the intersection of Valley and Normal. And so back in 1878, the cemetery was much smaller than it is today. This is 1906 map. And so Montclair State University, when it started, it was founded in 1908, 2 years after this map. But they already knew they were going to have this university. Well, it was called the Normal School back then. And so you can see up, I circled in blue, it says Normal School property. So this is 2 years before the founding of the university. I'm not sure when they actually built like College Hall and those sort of buildings, but they must have, maybe they were building them at this time. So now you see again the cemetery, but you see the cemetery goes up to this lot line back in 1906, and Thomas Van Reyper. See, back in those days, in 1870, 1878, in that era, Thomas Van Reyper owned all this land where the cemetery is, and in fact, Peter Speer, who was his father-in-law, Thomas married Peter Speer's daughter, Caroline, and so that united two prominent families. Peter Speer and Thomas Van Reyper were founding charter members of the Cemetery Association. And in fact, that smallest part of the cemetery is where the Van Reypers and the Speers are buried, that original part of the cemetery. Here's a 1933 map, and now you see it says Peter Van Reyper. So when his parents died, they died in around 1909 and in late 1890s, two of them. So one of the sons inherited the property. And so now at 1933, however, that lot line that was in the previous map, right here, see, they see these structures right up alongside Valley Road, up where I'm pointing to. Those were like barns. They owned horses and cattle, and they had barns there. So by 1933, this was all part of the cemetery now. In 1934, this is an insurance map. And now this one is more interesting for me, for the archaeology, because here you see the house. Then in the backyard, you see three structures that are mapped in. And in a few minutes, I'll show you some pictures from our excavation and what I think we dug up. But just remember, keep in mind the locations of those three structures, and then what I'm going to show you in photographs soon. All right, so this is sort of a summary of some of this, kind of the history of the use of the property. Those previous maps that I just showed you, I just took excerpts out of them to give you a bit of a chronology or timeline. I found these pictures. This is an 1890s view of the skyline, New York City skyline. And so this would have been more or less the view that the Van Reyper family could have seen during its occupation, in the early days of its occupation. So you can see this New York City skyline is, you know, quite a bit smaller than the current skyline as far as tall buildings go. But that was the skyline. So this is a picture I took from the porch of the of the Bond House, Van Reyper-Bond House. So that's the skyline that you can see today. So in the fall, when all the leaves are down, you can see it more clearly. Right, so here's that 1878 map again, and the reason I'm showing this again is now I've circled the names, locations of the Van Reypers and the Speers. They owned a lot of property up in this part of Montclair. a lot of real estate. Here again is a picture of the house from the, one thing I just should have mentioned a bit on this. In 1906, the historic map of the area, they labeled the house, they called that area Lookout Hill. And if you ever go up to where the Bond House is, it's for obvious reasons. It's got a great view of the surrounding landscape. And the fact that these people, even their names made it to these maps, not everybody who lives in a town gets their name on these maps. It's the prominent families. Sometimes you had to pay to get your name on the map. So people who had the means and the money, they wanted to be known that they were there. And also, if you build your house up on the top of Lookout Hill, and that house was a mansion by the standards, not a mansion like Upper Mountain Road standards of today, but back in the 1860s or 70s, that was a, you know, and it is a really nice house. Needs a little bit of work, but it is a mansion. And it's formally and architecturally, it's called an Italianate mansion, 19th century mansion. So, so you build this mansion up on Lookout Hill. You build it, you place it there, so you have a room with a view. Plus, you place it there so that people see you. You know, just like on Upper Mountain Road, it's a perfect example of conspicuous consumption. Unfortunately, one of the direct descendants of the Van Reypers, Nancy Terhune, she, after I'm done talking, I recommend you look around. I put up some of the posters we did a couple years ago for this project. Nancy Terhune, she co-curated this exhibit we did a couple years ago with me. She moved to Massachusetts a few months ago. She said she was going to come down tonight because I always think it's nice if you can locate any of the descendant community of the people to actually have them say a few words about it. After all, it's their family. But she had some issues with her dogs or something, couldn't make it. Okay, here's a picture, a photograph of Peter Speer to the right, and there's his grave to the left. And that's down, Peter Speer was the father-in-law of Thomas Van Reyper, and nice Dutch-looking man, you know, with the big pipe. And so he's buried right down in that oldest part of the cemetery. He was one of the founding charter members of the cemetery. Here's a stone, a monument for Thomas and Caroline, Thomas Van Reyper and his wife Caroline, the daughter of Peter. And so you see their age, their date ranges for, so Thomas died in 1909, his wife died in 1899. And there's photographs, and I really have to acknowledge Nancy Terhune and her family because they supplied us with these photos. And another picture from Nancy of Peter Speer about 1860, and you see Thomas, his son-in-law, sitting next to him. The Speers, Peter Speer lived in a house up on Upper Mountain Road. When you leave, if you turn right on Normal Ave outside of the university and go up to Upper Mountain and turn right, their house was up on the left, and it's still there. Okay, here's a picture of the house in about the 1920s. And that was, so Thomas Van Reyper had a grandson named Thomas Van Reyper, and that's the grandson standing in front of the house. So you can see if you go to the house today, it hasn't changed in any substantial way. It still looks the same. Probably in better condition back in 1920, but. All right, so now I'm moving, so every house has a history. You know, even my house has a history, and so you have an ownership history. And so the Van Reypers had the house until 1951, I think is the exact year. The last occupant of the house of the Van Reypers was a woman. She was a widow, and she and Nancy Terhune, she to this day does not know why, but she sold the house, and we have the bill, we have the deed transfer in our, we found that for $1 to George Bond. And that's why it's now called the Bond House. George C. Bond and his wife, they had been farmers in the Midwest back in the like 30s, and they lost the farm, you know, with the Depression, and they decided to pick up and start a new life out east, and they came here. And what they did is they opened an ice cream business, and they became very successful and rich. And with that money, right, I don't know why. Nobody knows why I'm pretty sure it was $1. I'll have to look up that deed, but it was not a lot of money even by those standards then. And but in any case, so this is showing the ice cream stand that they had, which was on Normal Ave down not far from the tracks, current railroad. And then they also had this like an ice, you know, the ice cream truck that goes around. They had their version of it that they would drive around. Okay, so anyway, so you have this, so that house was owned by two families, and that was it. The Van Reypers for many years, and then the Bonds. George Bond became a big, so he was like a benefactor of the Montclair State University, or what it was called Montclair College back then, or normal school. And then at some point it changed to Montclair College. But in any case, he was on, I don't think it was the board of directors, but something with the fundraising side of the university. And so he bequeathed the house to the university on his death. And so the university acquired the house, and yeah, I can't remember the year now, but the university has owned it for a number of decades. And all right, so that's the background research, and we have, if anybody's ever really interested, I've got a huge binder of archival documents, and we did a deed search through from the beginning to current times, and correspondence, letters from various people in the family, photographs for both the Bonds and the Van Reypers. So back to the archaeology now. So this is a, it's really hard to see in this slide. It's not projected very nicely, but the house is right here. You can see and here's the driveway that goes around the house. And so what we did is, and it's a fairly standard procedure in doing an archaeological study of a place that you're not sure what's out there. We placed a grid using survey, and Deborah, can you stand up for a minute and turn around? I just want to introduce Dr. Deborah Chatter-Ariamontri. The first year that we were in the field, Deborah helped us out a lot. Deborah is an archaeologist. She works in Italy in Roman archaeology, but she knows how to do basic archaeology. And so Deborah got this thing called a total station, which is a survey instrument to make maps with, working. It had been lying dead for years, and it's not a small task, and did a ton of work with the logistics and everything. So thank you, Deborah. But anyways, so the first thing we did is we put out a grid across the property using the survey instrument on a 5-meter interval, which is pretty much 16 feet, more or less. So about every 5 meters, we dug what's called a shovel test pit. I think I have a picture of that. Yeah. So here are the students. So the students are here to learn how to do this stuff, and we're also getting information at the same time, which is nice. And So here's this guy digging you see, so it's a sort of a small round hole, about 1.5 feet, 2 feet in diameter. You go down and when you're up in an upland setting like this on top of a hill, you have very little in the way of soil development. If you're down on the floodplain of a huge river, you have a lot of soil development or sedimentation, deposits from rivers and all. But you don't have to go very far at all, maybe a good, I don't know, 1/2 meter, 1.5 feet or something, before you hit what we call Pleistocene subsoil. There were no humans in the New World back in the Pleistocene, despite the claims of some people. The first people in the New World in the Americas came in about 13,000 years ago. So if you hit what's called Pleistocene subsoil, there's no potential for finding artifacts. You don't need to go any deeper, at least for archaeology. And so that's what we did. So so it doesn't take a long time to dig one of these holes, maybe 20 minutes, and then you throw the dirt up into the sifter, you look for artifacts, and you find any, you put them in a bag, you label it, and you move on. So it's very important to fill the hole back up before you move on. Otherwise, somebody walking along later will fall in and break a leg and sue the university. You don't want that. Susan Cole wouldn't like that. I would lose my job. Yeah, I don't remember why I showed this slide again. That's just the history of the slide. So now the thing is about those shovel tests. So we peppered the whole property of the Bond House lawns with, I don't know, several hundred of these holes. And after a couple of weeks of doing that, what you do is you take the artifacts from each hole, you count them up, you can sort them out into categories like glass, brick, nails, whatever, bones. And then you can put those frequencies on those counts directly on that grid map I showed you before. And once you do that, you're starting to get a sense of where there are concentrations of artifacts versus big areas where there's nothing. And so what we do then, so we call that like a stage 1 survey, where you're just trying to get a sense of, what's out there. And it doesn't take long to do, especially in a property of this size. And but then once you plot out those counts on the map, you can then use some judgment and say, okay, I want to go back to this area because you have like, say, 5 or 6 holes in the small area that have like, say, hundreds of artifacts versus a little ways away where there's like very little. It's a very good idea to test both those areas because maybe there's something going on where there's very little that might show up in a larger excavation unit that might be interesting. But then also you want to really hit those areas with high concentrations. So what you're seeing in this picture is where we were. So now we're in the backyard of the house. Okay, you can see the back of the house over there. There's that circular driveway. So now we're digging these larger holes. These are 1 meter by 1 meter in size, about 3.2 feet by 3.2. And in some cases now we're starting to find what's coming out of some of these are some structural foundation remains. And this is when I realized that, remember I said at the beginning, I'm a pessimist generally and I don't expect to find anything. I was pleasantly surprised. So what showed up back here, which we had no idea was there really, except from the historic maps, remember? I told you, keep in mind on the historic maps in the backyard there were 3 structures plotted from the insurance map of the 30s. I'm convinced that this is one of them, and I'm pretty sure I know which one of those that was on the map. And you see that it's a fairly well-constructed foundation or something. And we weren't sure really what it was, but it's a small square structure. And here it is cleaned up. And and what was quite interesting was as we excavated the interior of this structure, and we excavate them in these levels, we were using arbitrary 10-centimeter levels, which is about 4 inches. So for every level, you collect the artifacts, put them in a bag. When you get to the bottom of 10 centimeters, you close up that bag, So you go 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and so on. So that later in the lab, you can say you want to try to track if there's any sort of stratigraphic or vertical sorting of this material, which may have some importance in understanding the life history of this structure. Right. So the thing is about, I have some pictures of artifacts. Well, okay. Here's a photograph we got from the Bond family. And now you see a superstructure. And this is like an outdoor shed, like a garden shed that you may store garden tools or whatever. But it was also apparently like a focal point for like family gatherings here. They're having some nice meal out there. And probably a larger extended family and friends. So this photograph dates to about the 1940s or so, or 50s. Here's some pictures of the kids. One of these kids is a girl by the name of Jude Bond. She's now an adult woman. She lives in Vermont. But all right, so here, the reason I'm showing these two pictures paired is from the perspective of the photograph. That structure is there. I'm pretty sure that what we're excavating is just below that. That structure was no longer there today, as you see. We're digging holes there. There is no structure above ground anymore. But for a garden shed like this, you don't need a substantial subsurface foundation. You can just simply have a flat, put that thing on the, like you can go to Home Depot today and buy one of these things to get planted in your backyard. You don't need to have a basement for them or a structure. So I'm pretty sure that this structure in this photograph was completely unrelated to the use of this thing underground. I think this was built by the Van Reypers back in the 1800s for some reason. And I have some ideas about that. All right, this slide is showing our excavation on the left, the structure as it existed back when the Bonds owned the house. And now if you look at that house in the distance back there, that window that you see, I have to go take another picture someday when the leaves are off the trees, like now. But I circled the window there. You can just see beyond this telephone pole and that tree is the same window. So this is dating to when the Bond, so that house back there, it's basically just orienting ourselves that, from the same perspective of the photographer, me, the photographer in this case, and whoever took that picture, you're seeing the same, more or less, the location of that window vis-a-vis where we're excavating and where the house, or that little outbuilding was, the garden shed. I should just point out, one of the things in the history of this construction activities of the university, there was great need for parking on campus. There still is. It's a big point of concern by a lot of professors and students. And so at one time they built this parking lot, but I think in doing so, in this particular case, those three outbuildings that I showed you earlier on the map, I think we got one of them, the one closest to the house. The two that were further from the house, I'm pretty sure are underneath the parking lot. They probably, I'm guessing they're capped. They did, when you build a parking lot, it's not a hugely invasive kind of, ground disturbing process, not like building a foundation for a skyscraper. So they probably capped them. So potentially I could go out and hire a backhoe and go break up the parking lot to look for them, but then I'd probably get fired too for destroying or taking away parking spots.
Peter, I have a question.
Yeah.
Since the property was, you said it was landmarked as a historic registry property, was there a big problem with getting permits to do the parking lot at the time, since it might have had a
Right. So
effect on the property?
I did ask that question once when I went down to the State Historic Preservation Office when we were doing our background research, and the regulatory archaeologist that I was talking to, he brought out some code, and I can't remember the number and the name of it, but apparently, if it's a state institution like a university, there's some kind of exemption to these things. And frankly, I don't know what due diligence was done on the part of like the facilities people here in doing this kind of construction. I've presented some papers at professional meetings. I presented one paper at a professional meeting on this project in which I go more into the sort of the regulatory aspect of doing this kind of thing. And there are, this is really a tangent, but there are a number of universities these days, there's a number, I'd say about 10 across the country, that take the heritage of their campus very seriously. And it's become known as campus archaeology. So Michigan State University, for example, has a huge program in that. There's a school in California called Santa Clara University that is, they have such an active that there is a full-time professional archaeologist on the university payroll whose job it is to simply monitor this sort of thing on campus. So if there's, so that person, any of the construction people on that campus have to coordinate with this archaeologist when they have some plan in mind about building a building, this and that. They'll do an archaeological survey to see if there's anything there before they do it, just like, you know, the process works all over the country if there's any federal link to funding and all that. But Montclair State doesn't have that kind of awareness. I've been trying to suggest it, but, you know, only so far you get sometimes. This is showing some of the lab. So this is inside of our lab now. The logistics of this project were about as easy as they get. You could almost throw a rock from our lab to the excavation. Normally you have to drive for hours. So we were able to just carry stuff back at the end of each day easily. And so we got the university to kind of fit the lab to our needs, so they gave us, built this nice sink actually, with an industrial hose on it. And we have a silt trap underneath the sink to catch all the dirt so it doesn't constantly clog up the sink. And then these people are, you know, doing some of the artifact cataloging. And yeah, we found lots of artifacts, and I'm just showing you, you know, some samples. And so, you know, things you would expect in daily life of people's, in their lives: medicine jars, perfume jars, beer bottles. They liked it, beer. That's, you know, Dutch, you know. Holland, I had 2 fellowships in Leiden, Holland, and the beer is really great. This is nice for dating something. This is an Indian head penny that has the date of 1890. Although somebody today in 2015 could have an 1890 penny and lose it, so, you know.
Spears and the Van Reyper's immigrants?
No, they were all born here. Their family history, and some of that is on the poster. Where's the Van Reyper family? Oh, right there. Yeah. That this well, afterwards when you turn the lights up, but this Nancy Terhune, she put together this map, and so New Amsterdam is there, you know, New York, and so the Dutch were first, you know, like Peter Stuyvesant and all those people, and then then they started moving out of the city into neighboring you know, states and counties and all. So that's their history goes back to that. Here's a mason jar. Now the interesting thing, oh yeah, not such exciting artifacts, it's just broken window glass. But the thing that was interesting is the biggest pieces of, often when you find things like this archaeologically, you're finding just tiny little fragments of of this glass, not large pieces like this. And the same with those jars, that some of them were complete. All of that, those bigger things were found inside that square structure I showed you, right? Now, if you just, so that what this kind of the story that I have kind of constructed in my mind about sort of like the biography of a building or the life history of a building is back in the days when refrigeration may have just been coming on the scene, people had to keep things cold somehow. And one way, definitely before refrigeration, if you were, unless you're living in the tropics, but if up here, especially in the cold weather, you could have a subterranean storage facility outside the house. That would be a better storage place for dairy or meat and stuff than just sitting inside the house, unless you had well, they also had ice boxes back where people, the Hudson River, they had these ice farms, and you could buy ice. But you could also store things in, these, like root cellars, they're called root cellars. So I'm thinking that the original function of that, with the structure underground, was for something like that, I'm suggesting. However, or at some point though, when, say, they do get honest to goodness refrigeration in the house, you don't need that thing out there anymore. But you don't want this big hole in the ground because, again, it could become a liability. Some kid walking across the backyard falls in and breaks a leg. That was before the university, so they can't sue the university, but their parents aren't too happy. And so one thing that we do know from historical archaeology in general is that when one of these kinds of things reaches the end of its useful life, you just want to fill it up with a bunch of crap and just things that have been in your house that you've been meaning to get rid of anyways, and you just fill it up and then you cap it. Well, for archaeology, that's really great. It's like a time capsule because you're getting sort of these moments in time when they're depositing stuff from the household into this kind of place. Others of these kinds of features are, like I told you about privies before. Well, when the outhouse reaches the end of its useful life, you do the same thing. You throw all this junk in there, and that becomes, so archaeologists love excavating privies, believe it or not. And the same for cisterns or wells. When the well is no good anymore, you don't want the hole there, you just fill it up and you cap it. So I think, but what happens is when you're doing that kind of disposal, and you're not trampling on it afterwards or everything, you get what we call primary refuse, which is you just throw it out. The pieces may be broken like you see, but they're not really tiny pieces. And so you have better sort of preservation of, or larger pieces that are easier to get a sense of what they were. So I think the fact that we got such large pieces of window glass is supporting this argument that it was a sort of a primary refuse area to just fill up this hole. Like these sort of things, you know, it's rare to find such a large fragment of a beer bottle. Okay, so the last aspect of this project that what I call collaborating with the descendants, we made some serious efforts in trying to locate people who had occupied the house, and I think I got some leads from the unit. There was a woman in College Hall who Tim Renner knew was kind of kept it like university archives, and but in any case, I tracked down this woman, Jude Bond, and she was the granddaughter of George and Bertha, the ones who bought the house from the Van Ripers. So she lives in Burlington, Vermont now. Her husband works for the University of Vermont, and she's an artist in the community. But they were very interested in what we were doing, and which was nice. And so they came down during our first field season, and so we interviewed them. And here's that survey instrument that Deborah brought back to life. It's called the Total Station. And these are the students from the first round of, we had 2 field schools on this site, one in 2008 and the second one 2 years later in 2010. And I'm happy to say that this girl here, she had just graduated from Boston College and she was starting in the PhD program at Temple University in archaeology, but she hadn't had an archaeology field school, so she took this. And I heard since that she's finished her PhD, and she was one of the best students they had at Temple, that she went through the program very quickly. The guy up there with the glasses, that's Tim Renner, Dr. Renner. He's the director of our Interdisciplinary Center for Heritage and Archaeological Studies. And so I always have to acknowledge the various people. Yeah, we had some very nice orientations, the staff of these various institutions that are important in doing background research in any archaeological project. So in the case of New Jersey, you go to Trenton, and well, and also the Essex County Hall of Records. So people were very helpful for that. And right. Any questions? Okay, thank you.